As we've seen, bargaining success is associated with being in a position to be able to drive a hard bargain whilst successfully avoiding a similar hard bargain from your opponent. So we are having to play a game, to engage in a game of cat and mouse. We're using our poker face. We're trying to restrict the knowledge of our ultimate objective bargaining position. We're aiming to prevent our opponent from knowing what that might be, whilst trying as much as possible to understand as much as we possibly can about our opponent's actual, real bargaining strategy. We want to get under the surface of their poker face, to see their cards if we possibly can, whilst keeping our cards very, very close to our chest. So the kinds of behaviour that we associate with bargaining success under distributive bargaining approaches are like the kinds of behaviour that we imagine in a game of poker. We're thinking about someone behaving in a very shrewd manner, that communication is very closed, is very careful, that we are extremely limited in the kinds of behaviour, the kinds of communication that we allow our opponents to see from us. This is very different from the kinds of approaches that we've discussed in integrative bargaining, because we want to hide our position. We only want to present the face of our bargaining position in the way that we want it to be seen. We don't want any chinks in our armour. We want to present a united front, a clear, coherent and consistent story, and to do as much as possible to be able to understand the reality of what our opponents are really intending to do, what their bottom line is, whilst doing everything possible to avoid the same thing happening to us. So we've got this cat and mouse game going on. Now, this is particularly important because the ability of bargainers to actually strike a deal ultimately comes down to the resistance points of our bargaining positions overlapping to some extent. Now, what it is that we will ultimately accept as an absolute bottom line overlaps to some extent with what the resistance point of our bargainers' position might be. That the settlement points of where we actually agree between us will ultimately rest somewhere between those points. And if there is no overlap, then no deal is possible. But if there is an overlap, then the settlement will happen somewhere between their resistance points. The points beyond which they will not go, and the points beyond which we will not go. Now, the skill of a bargainer is in attempting to drag the negotiation, to drag the bargain further away from our resistance point and nearer to theirs. The nearer that we can push to where they don't want to go, then that's better for us. That's nearer to our ideal outcome, nearer to our most ambitious targets. The further it comes towards our resistance points, the better it is for the other side. The more of their agenda that they're able to win. And if we know, if somehow or other we know what their resistance point might be, then it gives us a lot more freedom in terms of being able to understand what the parameters of the negotiation are. It gives us an implicit advantage. So preparing to bargain, preparing to engage with your opponent is a really important part of laying the groundwork for success in negotiations. How can we figure out the other side's position? How can we figure out what their bottom line might be, what they might be prepared to accept? So how can we do this? Well, ideally it'd be great if there was somebody who would just tell us, but usually they won't, because they're doing exactly the same thing that we are. They're exercising discipline within their team. Nobody's been a blabbermouth. Everybody's keeping their powder dry. Nobody's letting slip anything that shouldn't slip. So what can we look to? Well, we can look to objective data, which might identify the strength of the parties' implicit bargaining conditions. So if this is an organisation which operates in product markets for goods, it produces things, so what's the level of inventory that it holds? If it has to, bring in supplies and turn them into something else in order to be able to sell them, if the organisation has an enormous amount of established inventory that it can continue to operate for some period of time without feeling the pain, without disrupting its revenue streams, then that strengthens its position. If, on the other hand, it operates, say, just-in-time approach, so that it is continually drawing in supplies in order to operate its productive systems, then as soon as you disrupt that process, the revenue cuts off. And you know then that that affects the objective strength of your opponent one way or another. What are the market conditions? Is there a huge amount of competition within the relevant product market? If the organisation is unable to satisfy its customers because of disruption to productive activity, will those customers immediately be able to go elsewhere, or is there more of a degree of lock-in in those markets so that their customer relationships, their reputation might be harmed, but their contractual arrangements will not be affected too badly? What's the level of profitability? Does this organisation have a large kind of cash surplus, so it can run on empty for some considerable time before it starts to feel the pain? What's the level of union strength? The union might huff and puff, it might talk the big talk, but does it actually have the strength to be able to sustain any degree of industrial action? So there's lots of objective data that we need to gather and to analyse as we prepare for bargains, so that we know what the broad parameters of this negotiation are. Who is strong, who is weak? There's also quite a lot of subjective data that we may be able to get our hands on. The grapevine, those informal communication networks in organisations, allows us to get a great understanding, whichever side of the bargain we're on, but allows us to get a really good understanding of the strength of feeling around particular bargaining issues. So it may be that there's a lot of chatter in the organisation about one aspect or another, which gives us an indication of just how hard one side or the other might be prepared to fight. So the union may pick up that a particular issue is seen as of strategic importance to the organisation, that they simply are not going to give way over this issue because they've seen it as being absolutely crucial to the future of the organisation. It's not simply another issue that can be bargained away or watered down. Similarly, on the other side, if all of the chatter around the workforce in an organisation is incredible anger or distress around a particular condition of employment, then employers may want to respond to that and understand that there is a lot of strength of feeling, so people will be prepared to take action. That it won't simply be a question of the bargainer beating their chest, but rather about representing some real strength of feeling, and that they may face quite a large degree of conflict if they're not prepared to compromise on those issues. So we do this as we prepare, as we lead into the bargain. We look for clues, we look for information that are either there, objective, organisational data, things that we can verify, and other kind of cultural level clues. clues, things that are going on, things that we hear, rumours, grapevine kinds of things. All of these are potentially important in understanding the parameters of the bargain as we move towards it. Now, we continue to engage in this information gathering process, even during negotiation. So sometimes it's very useful to have a member of your negotiation team, one of the bargainers, who is there simply to look for these verbal and non-verbal clues. Is there something that's been given away? Is there a code that is being spoken? Is the opposite side attempting to communicate something through tacit forms of communication? Now, it's very difficult for the lead negotiator, who is having to engage in that more active process of negotiation, who is responding and engaging directly with their opposite number, to do that, because it's very difficult to listen and respond and process and do all of that analytical work at the same time as being really aware of all of the little details that are going on. But if you've got someone in your bargaining team who is just looking for those clues, who is just monitoring what's being said, looking at the body language, seeing where the areas of discomfort are on the other side, that can be very useful to communicate back to the rest of your team, either during adjournments and breaks or through passing notes or whatever. Now, putting all of this information helps us to get a clearer idea about what the ultimate bargaining position of your opponent might be, where their bottom line might be, how far you're able to push them without getting to that resistance point where you start to really incur costs. So it gives you a clue as to just how hard you're able to bargain without risks. Now, of course, the opposite side of this process is to avoid your opponents being able to do this to you. So you have to be really good at reading them, and you have to be really conscientious at looking for information and intelligence, whilst also minimising the intelligence that's available to them. So you minimise those clues, you keep the poker face, you make sure that there's only a single channel of communication within the negotiation room. Other things that you can do, you can feign ignorance. Sometimes it can be very useful if a question is posed within limits, because you don't want to appear stupid, but appearing uninformed about an issue may allow you to deflect your bargaining opponent sufficiently so that you're simply able to avoid the unwitting provision of unwelcome intelligence to the other side. Another thing that you might do as a kind of strategic decision might be that if you have an issue which is really important to you, but you don't want to communicate just how valuable that thing is to your side, because once the other side knows it's valuable, then they'll want to start trading all kinds of other issues off in exchange for that. So maybe you want to submit all kinds of proposals. Maybe you want to have all kinds of things that you say, this is important and that's important, and we want this thing and that thing and the other, we want some of this and some of that. And that within there is the really crucial issue. But you want to obscure its importance to the other side so that they can't identify it as a key bargaining chip for you. Sometimes we might want to try and explicitly change our opponent's perceptions. And so we may engage in tactical arguments. The arguments that we use are intended to change the way that somebody thinks about what they are saying themselves. So, for example, if we are faced with a bargaining demand that we are really not comfortable with at all, one of the things that we might do, rather than simply saying, no, we can't have this, is to try to sow seeds of doubt about the usefulness of that thing to the people who want it. So we use tactical arguments. So you might say, let me explain the consequences of your demand. And then we take them through all kinds of horrible consequences that rebound on them if we were willing to give them what they wanted. That actually, this is a terrible idea from your point of view. We're just trying to do you a favour and avoiding walking into a bear trap. So we can use tactical arguments to sow the seeds of doubt into their own position, to loosen their commitment to what it is that they're asking for, which allows us, again, more freedom. It swings the balance of advantage to your side of the table. And sometimes we might use procedural tactics. So if we find that we're not getting anywhere in terms of the negotiation and the relationship that you have with your opposite number, your bargaining opponents, we might think about going over the head of your bargaining opponent and talking directly to their principals. Now, of course, this is a high-risk strategy because it risks fundamentally damaging the relationship that you might have with your opposite number within the negotiation, and that kind of trust can be very difficult to regain. But by going over the head of your bargaining opponent, talking directly to their principles, you may be able to completely undermine their position and to reach some kind of outline understanding with the people that they represent in a way which then destroys their position within the negotiation itself. We can also attempt to alter our objective bargaining strength. We've talked about how understanding your opponent's bargaining position and their strength at the outset of the negotiation is important, but we can also build our strength deliberately heading into a negotiation. So the aim here is to increase the effect of any costs within the negotiation to your opponent and minimize the costs of any action on yourself. So in an employment relations negotiation, we're talking about strike costs primarily. So what you want to do as a bargainer is to make the strike much more expensive for your opponent than it would be for you. So if you're a union negotiator, you may wish to build up a very generous strike fund. German unions, big engineering German union, IG Metall, very well known for identifying and developing these very large strike funds and then targeting one employer. And the employer knows that the union can sustain a very long, damaging strike because it can basically replace the wages of their entire workforce. So the more that a union is able to protect its members from the consequences of strike action, the more willing that those members are willing to engage in it, obviously. So, the extent to which they can build these implicit advantages is a very important source of strength within the bargain. It may be that negotiators want to only creep towards that kind of full-scale industrial action, and maybe they want to take more limited actions which disproportionately affect their opposite side, more kind of guerrilla tactics that are employed. So taking industrial action that's short of a strike, just work to rule, to limit the productivity of the workforce in a way that the organisation isn't able to stop paying them because they're still undertaking their duties, but they're not working to their full capacity, perhaps. Or maybe it's about the timing of the negotiation or the timing of the strike that is designed to hurt in a particular way. So on the company side, it may be that the company wants to insulate itself from the effects of strike, and that they might do this, as we discussed, by building up inventory levels, stock levels, to provide maybe potential alternative productive capacity. Kinds of things that the labour movement had described for years as the use of scab labour, of strike breakers, all of these kinds of things. Now, of course, all of these tactics have built-in risks particularly the risks of damaging the wider employment relationship beyond the negotiation. And so they should all be used with a good degree of caution. But the effective operation of a bargainer is about the skillful identification and use of these various tactics that are used at the right time in the right way to exercise and to apply pressure to their opponent in a way that leads to more effective outcomes within the bargain.